Welcome back, everybody, to Man vs. Machine. We are post-NFL draft. We had a great time inside Kansas City, Dario. I got to meet you for the first time in person. We had the entire player profiler crew at the house live inside Kansas City. We had media credentials. We had a team down at the draft. Theo had a picture with he took a couple pictures, didn't he? But he got a picture with Bijan, which was awesome.
Yeah, the Bijan selfie.
The Bijan selfie. He had to flex on us for that one. You and I were at the house working like madmen, typing away, getting the projections updated as the picks were coming in. It was definitely a difficult task, but we were able to power through it, man and machine together, got it done. We were able to hammer it through. And you and I were agreeing on probably 90+% of all these projections that were coming out live. I looked at you and you're like, yep, I agree. We're maybe off by 0.5% on some of these target shares or rushing shares. We're talking about how we thought this was going to play out inside the system with the coaches. Number wise, we were very close. We were posting it. The crew upstairs was giving us a lot of flack because of we are realists here. We're talking about what's happening inside these crews and making sure that they know that, hey, I get it. We love some of these prospects coming out of college, but they're in the NFL now. Let's talk about what's available. Let's talk about target share. Let's talk about opportunity. Let's talk about expected run plays. Let's talk about expected pass plays. And let's work all this magic together. Man talking about the coaches and all of the different systems and what's going to affect it. The machine working through all the algorithms. And boom, here we are. Man and machine combining forces again, Dario, because we agreed on all these.
Yeah, I mean, this is dangerous, right? When we get in this zone, it's like almost too powerful, right? You just gotta. Everyone else has to watch out I think that if this doesn't convince people, then I'm not sure what could. But yeah, I think, like you said, I mean, we're going to talk about basically a running back, a receiver, a tight end, one each position, one guy whose landing spot we really liked, talk about his projection, and then vice versa with one guy we really feel kind of uncertain about because of the landing spot, even though we were more excited for them pre-draft. So I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, before we hop into it, I want to just talk about Kansas City briefly. So we all met in Kansas City. We were cooking all night. Dario, I find out on the second night, Dario doesn't have a blanket for like 2 days. So I didn't know he had a blanket downstairs the first night. The second night, we had a sewage issue at the house. And so Dario moved his bed to the couch.
The infamous sewage issue. I think it's already been referenced on like every podcast that we've done since then.
And so I wake up early on day 2. I'm downstairs. I'm getting ready to do the game plan with Maddie to talk about the landing spots from round 1. And I see Dario asleep on the couch. He's got this like little jean jacket over him, trying to sleep on the couch as everybody's loud downstairs and making coffee. And he comes up to me and all starry-eyed and says, "Hey, Billy, can I sleep in your bed? I just would really like to get some sleep." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, Dario. Go ahead and go upstairs." He goes, "This," and then I wake you up
probably like 8:00 in the morning, just for reference. In Central Time, I'm coming from the West Coast.
And so Dario goes upstairs. He passes out. I get done with the game plan. I'm getting all prepared to get our station set up for projections for the next day. We're ready to rock and roll. I'm like, "Where's Dario?" So I go upstairs to my bedroom. Dario's passed out, like legit out. Like doesn't even hear me walk in. I've already used the restroom. I've already closed the door. Like I moved things around, shuffling around. I walk up and give him a little tap on the shoulder. "Hey, buddy, we got to get up and go." And he looks at me, eyes crossed, like he looks like he just came out of this slumber, like Sleeping Beauty style. And I'm like, "How'd you sleep?" And he goes, "That's the first blanket I've had in 2 days."
Oh, yeah, that's all you need to know.
But had a blast. We were able to get a lot of cooking done. We had a good time with some barbecue. But enough about us in the draft. Although it was fun, I could talk about it all night.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing I didn't know about you was that you're basically a chef. Like Billy was out here making full blown breakfasts every morning. The ribs that you were making on Saturday night when I was leaving for the airport, I was so sad that I was missing out on that. Those smelled so good.
They ended up turning out pretty good. I tell people, don't judge me off my cooking inside of an Airbnb. I didn't have my regular setup. But let's go ahead real quick before we jump into these rookies. That's what people are here for. Let's take a quick word from our sponsors. When we get back, we're going to can't even talk, Dario. We're going to jump into the running back position.
Let's take a moment to talk about Underdog Fantasy. Now, many of you have already signed up. Thousands have signed up from Player Profiler already over the years. Underdog has supported us since 2020. Much of what you see on Player Profiler is because of Underdog, because of their support. Get the Underdog app, plug in that promo code Underworld, and they're making the NBA fun. Their NBA pick'ems, it's changed my Wednesday night. It's changed my Sunday afternoon. I used to play Underdog just for the best ball drafts. I mean, the best ball drafts are amazing. These draft rooms fill so quickly, and you can win life-changing money. You want to take advantage of all the sleepers we talk about on this show? Well, what better place than in an Underdog draft room to do that? And I recommend taking your Underdog play to the next level by diving into their NFL pick'ems. It's important to correlate those NFL pick'ems. You can pick both the quarterbacks and the wide receivers to exceed expectations. Correlate them, and you can 5x your payout. Bada bing, bada boom. Underdog Fantasy, the promo code is Underworld. For an instant deposit match up to $100. Underdog is the truest friend of the underworld.
Bada beam, bada boom. We're off to the running backs here. First one on the chart, Devon Achane. He comes in as our running back 35, Dario, in PPR. He was drafted pick 3.21, the Miami Dolphins. Best comparable player in the database right now is Chris Johnson. And he has that speed that Miami loves. They have the Tyreek Hill speed. They have the Jalen Waddle speed. Achane comes in with a 4.32 40-yard dash, which is 99th percentile inside the database over at Player Profiler. 80th percentile speed score, 91st percentile in the college dominator. And he has a 14.7% college target share, which was 93rd percentile. The downside to Achane, he's a bit undersized, 5'9", 188 pounds. Burst score, when you consider all the height and agility, comes in at 18th percentile. Not really built to be a 3-down back. However, we do have him projected to be pretty efficient this year inside 2023. We have him splitting carries with Jeff Wilson and Mostert with 30% rush share. That comes in about 126 carries, 567 rushing yards, 4.4 touchdowns on the ground. He has right now projected for an 8.5% target share, which equates to 50 targets, 36 receptions, 290 receiving yards, and 1.6 receiving touchdowns. Dario, you and I both looked at each other. You called this pick, by the way. You said, how sick would it be if Achane lands on the Dolphins? And it was like half a round before it happened. And then right when the name called to me, you looked at me and I was like, no, it didn't happen. It happened. Talk about why you love him as well.
The reason that I was excited for this, before it even happened, was that Achane, fastest back in the class, 99th percentile 40-yard dash. I mean, yeah, the speed score is not quite as impressive because he's obviously a little bit on the lighter side, but that doesn't matter to Mike McDaniel. Like, Tyreek Hill is far from being the biggest wide receiver in the league, but it doesn't matter. I mean, he was able to lead the league I guess he was second in receiving yards, second across the board in fantasy points. I think that Mike McDaniel is an offensive guru. Any running back should be happy to land on his team. And then on top of that, the competition at running back for this team is one of the weakest in the entire league. I mean, Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert are both kind of dusty veterans. They've both been in these Shanahan, McDaniel systems before, and they've both had injury problems before. So it's kind of just a perfect mix of open competition. I think he's going to very much get the chance to earn plenty of touches from Mostert and Wilson. Like you said, I mean, we're projecting him for where'd he go? Achane. We're projecting him for 126 carries and 50 targets right from the jump. I think that he has a very strong chance to become the leader of this backfield. And then on top of that, you factor in the fact that the rest of this offense is just speed. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are probably one of, if not the best duos in the NFL at wide receiver. And now opposing defenses are going to have to worry about one more layer in Devon Achane and the speed that he brings out of the backfield. I mean, I'm sure that McDaniel's going to get him going in some really gadgety ways. I think between those three offensive weapons, this offense is going to be completely insane for opposing defenses to try to stop. And I think that we're going to see at least 2 60+ yard touchdowns from Achane this year, if not more. That's like an absolute minimum.
ADP over at Underdog right now is 134. It's climbing though. Where do you expect his ADP to settle once everything is said and done? Do you think it's like a round 6 through 8 kind of guy, or what do you expect?
I think it'll settle somewhere in the 90s. I mean, that's where we saw a lot of these running backs that kind of, I think, are those high upside committee backs, right? I mean, Ramondre Stevenson last year, I remember he was going around 120. He got steamed up to the 90s by the end of the summer. And James Cook, similar deal. I mean, he was going around the 100th pick on Underdog last summer. So I think that 134 right now for Achane is no doubt going to go up. I mean, I think we have him ranked like somewhere in the 80s in our raw seasonal rankings. And then in our Underdog rankings, which do bake in ADP somewhat, we have him ranked at
119.
What was that?
119, because it has the ADP affecting it right now.
Yeah, 119. So we're 15 spots ahead of ADP on him. We're going to stay well ahead of ADP on him. I can guarantee that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with how our rankings work, the man and the machine sit here. We do our projections together. I run through the model first. Dario tells me where I'm right and wrong. They get tweaked. And then from there, they get punched into Dario's algorithm, which also considers ADP for that given platform. So if we're higher on a player, they still stay higher than ADP. It might dip maybe 6, 8, 9, 10 spots, depending upon how far down average draft position is. So that way you're not overreaching on a player, right? So if we're 50 spots on a player, we're not telling you to take them 50 picks ahead of where they're going in ADP. We're trying to get you closer to where they actually go in ADP, while also guaranteeing that you're going to be able to lock them in. So it does take a little bit of time for them to adjust once the draft does happen. We'll go through and probably manually adjust some of these players as well. We noticed them being too low compared to where we want them being drafted when ADP hasn't yet caught up. Prime example here, Devon Achane. But I would say that, if you continue to follow our podcast here on Man vs. Machine, follow the rankings over at Player Profiler, you will notice a trend when we're talking about a lot of these players. Let's move along to a running back that we were both very high on prior to the NFL draft. However, landing spot, not a great spot. And that is going to be Israel Abanikanda. And we love his athleticism, right? He was uber athletic. He came into the draft 4.5 40-yard dash, 82nd percentile speed score, 97th percentile burst score, right? He's a plus size back at 5'10", 216 pounds. He has that nice, size and speed combo. Average 6 yards per carry in college, 97th percentile dominator in college. The bad part, he wasn't drafted until pick 509 to the Jets. He's going to be playing behind Breece Hall. We saw how electric he was last year. Yes, he's coming off injury, but we expect him to be the lead back once he's fully healthy and on the field. He's probably playing behind Carter. He might be playing behind Bam Knight. This is kind of a mess here for Abanikanda. How far up this depth chart do you think he rises? Because right now the projections have him as RB79, 10% rush share, which is 37 carries, a little over 200 rushing yards, 225 rushing yards, 1.7 touchdowns. Only 2% of the target share, 12 targets, 7 receptions, 68 receiving yards, and about a quarter of a touchdown in the air. How far up does he climb, and what does it take for him in order to become fantasy relevant?
I mean, I think for starters, he needs to have just a terrible season from Breece Hall in terms of injury luck, right? I mean, we've seen guys come back from major knee injuries and struggle to get healthy, but all the reports we've heard regarding Breece Hall have been very positive, right? It was a very clean ACL tear. He's, unlike Javonte Williams, there is a much more optimistic projection for Breece Hall's health. But in order for Israel Abanikanda to be able to, I think, contribute in fantasy this year, he needs things to go south for Breece Hall and basically win an open competition with Michael Carter and Zonovan Knight to be Breece Hall's backup. Because Michael Carter and Zonovan Knight, they haven't been bad in what we've seen in the NFL and what we've seen fantasy-wise. I mean, Zonovan Knight had a couple of weeks where he was chalky in DFS last year. Michael Carter was very passable as a rookie before he got Michael Cartered. I mean, that kind of became a saying because of him for the drafting of Breece Hall replacing him. So I think that it's going to be a very competitive backfield. I mean, like you said, we have him projected behind all three of those guys in terms of carries and in terms of targets. So I think that Israel Abanikanda is mean, he's probably going to make the roster. They spent a 5th-round pick on him, but I wouldn't be surprised if he scores like less than 20 fantasy points total this season. It's going to be a long climb for him to be relevant. And another thing, too, you mentioned how optimistic we were about his profile. He did get worse draft capital than I think many people hoped or expected. I think if he would have gone on day 2, like somewhere late in round 3, like Devon Achane, we're having a very different conversation. But if you're a 5th-round pick to a team that already has a stable of running backs, even though it's the Jets and we expect them to take a step forward on offense this season, I don't think that it's enough that, I mean, unless you're in like a 30-round draft, you probably don't need to be thinking about Israel Abanikanda right now.
Great comments there. We had a question here in relation to what I discussed about the average draft position on the site and rankings. The question is from Jamie here. It says, so should I compare the seasonal ranks to the underdog ranks to see the players you are higher or lower on? No, the easiest solution is to just look at where we have them ranked and then look at what their average draft position is. If you see it significantly higher, you know we're higher on them. And just know that as ADP changes, those ranks will probably change as well. And then vice versa. If we're significantly lower on them versus ADP, then you know that we're lower on the player. So that's the easiest solution. And you can also feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, and we can answer those for you as well. Or on Discord. Hit us up on Discord as well. Next one, Dario. I'm going to put the glasses on for this one because this guy looked clean inside the draft, Dario. So for the remainder of the podcast, let me make sure they're straight. I'm wearing the stunner shades. Mine aren't stunners like his, but these are my pilot shades. These are my aviators. But Jordan Addison, love the landing spot. Drafted with pick 1.23 of the Minnesota Vikings. They had a need for wide receiver after letting go of Adam Thielen for agency. We saw him walk. Team has 143 vacated targets in this offense, 1,100 vacated air yards. They're the number 8 pass heaviest team in the NFL, according to our projections. Comes in with a 4.49 40-yard dash. Best comparable player inside the database is Deontay Johnson, and it speaks to what he can do as a route runner. He has smart use of footwork to beat coverage. He has ability to run complex routes. Also has punt return experience as well, which will be good for his playing time. The cons, he only has 2 touchdowns over his last 7 games in college. He's inconsistent at tracking the deep ball. He comes in with some mediocre or less than stellar, speed scores at 19th percentile, 37th percentile burst score, 31st percentile catch radius. Nonetheless, volume is king when it comes to fantasy football, and he's projected as our wide receiver 41 in redraft. He's the only rookie that we have projected inside the system right now for 100 targets. We haven't projected for exactly 100 targets. 17% target share, Dario, 101 targets, 65 receptions, 803 receiving yards, and 5.2 scores. Whew, that'd be a pretty good year for a rookie.
Oh yeah, I think I've made this comparison before, but this is just like when Calvin Ridley was drafted by the Falcons when they already had Julio Jones. It's another elite wide receiver who's going to be that 1B role. They're both slightly smaller, shiftier route running guys. I think, like you said, the biggest scare with Addison came on the day of the combine. I mean, at 173 pounds, you would really have liked to see him run closer to 4.4 flat. Instead, he ran a 4.49, basically a 4.5. And that was discouraging. I think it punished him in the draft stock. I think that he was in the conversation to be the wide receiver 1 in this class until that happened on the day of the combine. But I think we shouldn't double count that as a negative, right? We already know that. That's been baked into his draft capital. The Vikings know that about him. And at the end of the day, this is a guy who's, like you said, an elite route runner. He won the Biletnikoff Award as a sophomore, then transferred to USC, the best college that there is. And then he I think he had a bit of a mixed bag that last year under Lincoln Riley because he dealt with some injuries, and then he also wasn't like completely in on 100% of the pass plays. I think the injuries kind of limited his usage over the course of the season. But I mean, you talk about, you said he had 2 touchdowns in his last 7 games. Dude had 17 touchdowns in 14 games the year before that. I would not be worried. And like you said, in terms of landing spot, in terms of projections, why we're talking about these guys as our favorites today, it's the fact that he lands in Minnesota where they had a clear need at wide receiver 2, and they have a clearly pass-heavy offense. I mean, Kirk Cousins and Kevin O'Connell were more than happy to be top 10 in pass attempts last season. I don't see any reason why that changes. And we also know that he's not going to be the focal point for opposing defenses because he's going to be on the field with Justin Jefferson. So it's not like a situation where we're worried that he's going to be so great. I mean, it's like kind of like Drake London last year, right? Another receiver out of USC gets drafted to the Falcons in the first round, and he's immediately the best wide receiver on his team. The amount of defensive attention that he was receiving last year is not going to compare to what Addison receives this year, because I mean, you're never going to double team Addison. You have Justin Jefferson to worry about.
TJ Hawkinson.
And Hawkinson too. I mean, Hawkinson took a bit of a hit in our projections because of this pick. I mean, he was slated for just an absolutely monster workload because the Vikings didn't have a wide receiver too. Now they do have one, and Jordan Addison, wheels up, baby.
I'm not taking the glasses off, Tara. I'm leaving them on the rest of the time.
Well, yeah, wheels up. We're flying.
We're flying now. That's right. I missed the punchline. God damn it. All right. Receiver who we're not that high on, Michael Wilson. Oh, man. I loved the talent, right? 6'1", 216 pounds. You know, he had above average metrics. He had a 68th percentile speed score. He had a 76th percentile burst score, 79th percentile agility score, 73rd percentile catch radius, right? College dominator, kind of middle of the pack as well, 63rd percentile. And so overall, though, he lands here at pick 331. So literally the end of round 3 over to the Arizona Cardinals. We find out that DeAndre Hopkins looks like he's staying now inside Arizona. I would have liked this a lot more had we known DeAndre Hopkins was gone. But as of today, it looks like they're going to continue to have DeAndre Hopkins. Looks like we still have Marquise Brown. We still have Rondale Moore. You know, we still have Ertz coming back from injury. There's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. I know as cliche as that sounds, it's true. So not enamored by the landing spot, to say the least. He comes inside of our rankings here. Let me pull up the receiver rankings. Wilson comes in at, and keep going, wide receiver 108, Ariel. Why don't you walk us through the projection?
That's rough. I think that one thing we have to keep in mind, like you said, there's so many mouths to feed in this offense, but it's also an offense that we're not expecting to be particularly good this year. I don't think that they're going to be as fast-paced or as pass-heavy as we've seen them in the last couple of years because Cliff Kingsbury is gone. So you have a big step back for the pass volume and play volume of that offense. You have a step back in quarterback play because Kyler Murray is going to miss probably at least 6 weeks. I'm pretty sure he's going to end up on the PUP, and I think that they're going to have no incentive to rush him back because they're just going to be having a nightmare season with, you know, some combination of Jeff Driscoll and Colt McCoy as their quarterbacks early on. And then you mentioned it too. DeAndre Hopkins has been the sort of looming piece over this offense in terms of how we project them for fantasy. And he's seemingly not going anywhere. I saw that video too, where he was saying, like, you know, who said I'm leaving? So it sounds like he thinks he's staying. And I mean, we slotted him in ahead of Greg Dortch in our projections. I think that that's fair if Rondale Moore stays healthy. Yeah. I think that, you know, Rondale and Dortch are probably going to end up, you know, blocking each other in terms of the routes they run and the way they're used. So I think that Michael Wilson's not going to be as affected by them. But as long as DeAndre Hopkins is healthy and playing, he's going to command a 20+% target share of this offense. Marquise Brown has always been a 20+ target share receiver. And then, you know, everyone's optimistic about McBride. You mentioned Ertz coming back. There's just too many pieces and not a good enough offense for us to be at all optimistic about Michael Wilson his rookie year.
Someone we're both optimistic about moving on to the tight end position is Sam LaPorta. Oh, man, we both looked at each other when this happened. We just shook our head in agreement. We loved the landing spot. Detroit took him at pick 203 inside the draft. It addressed a large void inside their tight end core, right? They had nobody after trading away.
We got to take a second to point out 203. That's the 34th overall pick in this draft. That's where Michael Pittman's been drafted. Like, that's ahead of so many absolute studs. We thought Michael Mayer was going to be the clear-cut tight end 1 in this class, and they drafted Sam LaPorta over Michael Mayer. Michael Mayer ended up being the tight end 3. So this is elite draft capital. But go ahead.
Yeah, elite draft capital, but it shows inside of his metrics, right? 4.59 40-yard dash, 91st percentile for tight ends, 85th percentile speed score, 76th percentile burst score, 90th percentile in agility score. This team has 80 vacated targets in Detroit with the absence of Swift now. The only cons that I really see with LaPorta is that he is a little bit below average, for a tight end. Comes in at 6'3", so a bit undersized. And, when it comes to catch success when challenge the balls, he has below average catch success in that category as well. And he's very inconsistent as a blocker, also due in part to his size. So it may hinder him from seeing the field as much as we would like to see him in year one as a rookie. Nonetheless, he comes in as tight end 28 inside of our projections, 9% target share, which is pretty modest in my opinion, 53 targets, 38 receptions, 461 receiving yards, and 3.4 scores.
I mean, much like the Addison landing spot, this is just absolutely perfect when it comes to a team that had a clear need on their roster, addressing it with a guy that we were already optimistic about as a prospect. Like when they traded TJ Hawkinson, the rest of the season, their tight end room was Shane Zylstra, Brock Wright, and then the other guy we had in this spreadsheet whose name started with a J. I'm like totally blanking. But they had three completely irrelevant tight ends who were, occasionally getting a touchdown here or there. And, I think a lot of people suspected they'd be drafting a tight end, but spending this draft capital on a guy who was so great in college. I mean, if you see what he's able to do after the catch, the amount of tackles that Sam LaPorta was breaking at Iowa, and he also led all the tight ends in this class at slot yards per route run. So that's a key stat if you think about how tight ends are deployed in the NFL now, and it tells us a lot about how NFL teams are going to view him. Because if you're getting a lot of yards per route run in the slot as a tight end, you're basically another offensive weapon that the defense has to account for. That's that's the stat that you always see Travis Kelce and George Kittle leading the league in. So, I mean, he's been comped a lot to George Kittle, right? You have the Iowa tight end blood coming through, and he's just been so efficient as a route runner, and just going to be, like you said, we're very optimistic, and I agree with you. 9% target share is pretty conservative. I mean, there's Amon-Ra St. Brown is in this offense, but there's going to be 6 weeks where Jameson Williams is suspended, and we've seen some flashes from Josh Reynolds and Khalif Raymond last year. They did sign Marvin Jones. So there are other receivers to worry about. I mean, they drafted Jahmyr Gibbs, who's probably going to get a ton of targets as well. But I think that Sam LaPorta is very much going to have a chance to contribute as a rookie tight end, which we don't see very often.
They pointed out the receiver that we couldn't remember, or the tight end that we received his name. The reason why no one remembers his name, because he sucks. It's James Mitchell. Nobody cares. All right, let's move on to another tight end that no one's going to care about in 2023, and that's Darnell Washington. So we loved his athleticism, right? 6'7", 264 pounds, big tight end out of Georgia, taking that pick 3.30 inside the draft to the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is great, very great, because they need another offensive lineman, Dario. And that's what he is. He's another offensive lineman. He tweeted out he was what was the tweet that you said about him being I forget what the tweet was. It was hilarious about him. He essentially, it was that he couldn't wait to contribute blocking inside of the offense, right? And like for fantasy, we don't want to hear that, right? But despite all his metrics, right, 96th percentile in speed score, we know he's going to be used more as a blocker in year one. They already have Pat Freiermuth. He's going to be playing behind Pat Freiermuth. He's going to be used as a blocker in line, not something that we want from a tight end in fantasy. So we definitely moved him down our rankings in the preseason projections. What else do you guys say about him?
Another thing to keep in mind is the reason he fell into the third round was because NFL teams were concerned about his medicals. So that's always a little bit of a red flag just from an overall fantasy perspective too, because clearly there was something there that prevented or scared NFL teams from drafting him any earlier. I mean, he's talked about as one of the elite athletes at tight end in this entire class, but that didn't stop teams from waiting and letting him fall to basically the end of the third round. And like you said, this is a team that already has a pass catching tight end. It's kind of the inverse of Sam LaPorta, where LaPorta is a little smaller than you'd like to see for a tight end, but that means he's a little bit more of a receiver. And Darnell Washington is so massive that he's going to be deployed to block on a lot of plays for Najee Harris. So I think that, we got actually someone in the comments here asking, how does Darnell Washington help Najee's value? And I think Najee should be more efficient because they drafted Broderick Jones in the first round, who's an absolute beast. And then they drafted Darnell Washington in the third. They're clearly making some investments in that blocking scheme. I mean, their offensive line has really struggled these last couple of years. So it's encouraging to see that for Najee's perspective. But I think for Darnell Washington's relevance in fantasy, it's just gonna take an injury to Pat Freiermuth. I think I don't see any other path to relevance for him. How about you?
100% agree. And I agree. It definitely helps Najee. Najee should moved up in our rankings because, like Dario said, Broderick Jones added in round 1. I had Broderick Jones going top 10. I think I had him going to, I think it was to Chicago because they also needed help on the offensive line. I had Joey Porter going to them in round 1, and they got him in round 2. I loved the Steelers draft. I think they had one of the better drafts inside, 2023. But listen to what they did to help their offensive line. They take Broderick Jones in round 1, offensive tackle. They come back and take in the second round with their second pick. They come back and get Benton. Sorry, this is on the defense of the ball because they also need help on the defense line. They come back and get Benton in the defense side of the ball. They also get Darnell Washington in the third round to help their offensive line. Right. So all they did was a draft offensive line and defense this entire draft. Listen to this. Offensive tackle, cornerback, defensive lineman, tight end, who's technically a blocker, linebacker, defensive back, offensive lineman. Love the draft because that was the need for this team. They already had Pickett. They already had a running back. They already had, receivers. This is exactly what they need to do. The Steelers went out and did it. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about from a team building perspective, a team like the Lions, people talk about how if you build a team from the inside out, strengthen the trenches, the offensive line first, and then add the weapons, that's how the Lions are building their team, right? I mean, they've had a really strong offensive line last year, and then they've added Jameson Williams, they've added Jahmyr Gibbs. The Steelers have been the opposite of that team building philosophy, where they've drafted Pickett, Pickens, and Najee Harris, all with pretty high draft capital the last couple of years. And now they're starting to fill that offensive line to give those guys a chance. Because, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but if you watched any Steelers games last year, I was worried for Kenny Pickett's life. Like, that dude got nearly decapitated multiple occasions.
Well, I know, like the weekly rankings, I just kept moving Najee. Like the win every week was moving Najee below ECR because he couldn't run. They had no room. They were just stuffing the box. They're loading up the box. He was it just horrible cards he was dealt last year. Expect better this year in 2023. Well, Dario, you said before the podcast, we should probably have some honorable mentions here because I have a feeling we're going to fly through all of these guys that we have projected or we're going to mention in the projections. And I like to say that the machine was right. Because he is the machine. So let's move on to the honorable mentions. Back to the running back position. Let's talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs comes in as RB number 18. Ooh, love it, love it, love it. It might be too low. We got to relook at this, actually. But he comes in as RB 18 inside of the projections. We have him right now for a 38% rush share. That is, second to David Montgomery, who's at 48%. Nobody's over 50% in this offense. Jahmyr Gibbs with 174 rushing attempts as a rookie, 784 rushing yards, 6.8 rushing touchdowns. But where does he make his money? It's going to be the passing game. Target share at 8.5%, 50 targets. We have projected for 38 receptions, 322 receiving yards, another 2.5 scores on the ground. He dominated college inside the college target share, 14.7% target share in college, which was 93rd percentile. Lions put their money where their mouth was. They moved him, or they picked him up at pick 112. No one thought he was going to go this early. He does. We cannot ignore the draft capital that the Lions spent in order to acquire him. They clearly hated Swift. They moved on from Swift, sent him to the Eagles. Gibbs steps into a massive workload now with a two-headed beast inside this backfield. What else do you have to say about Gibbs?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that on draft night, this did not look like as good of a landing spot as it does now. I mean, we had some pretty strong suspicions that DeAndre Swift would get traded, But you have to wait until that actually happens until you reflect that in the projections. Once that happened, I think Jahmyr Gibbs went from like running back 28, 29 maybe to running back 18. Like you said, that could be a little bit pessimistic because you have on the one hand a free agent who they gave $12 million to, $8 million guaranteed, and a running back who they drafted 12th overall, who I think just with that pick, you're probably looking at 20 million guaranteed over the course of his rookie contract. So there's already more investment in draft capital and in money with Jahmyr Gibbs. And like you said, he's an absolute weapon out of the backfield, just catching passes. I think, I talked about yards per route run with Sam LaPorta. I think pretty sure that according to the college yards per route run stats that I've seen, that Jahmyr Gibbs was at the top of this class for running backs too. So he's a complete monster when it comes to catching passes. And like you said, no one thought he was going to be drafted this high. I mean, toward the end of the lead up to the draft, it was starting to sound like he might go round 1, but I don't think any of us thought that would be top 25. I mean, he was going to be probably, like Travis Etienne was drafted 25th, 26th overall. I think it was that sort of territory we were envisioning for Jahmyr Gibbs. People thought of Etienne as a pass catcher coming out, Gibbs as a pass catcher. I think that's what we all envisioned at the idea of Gibbs going in the first round. But to be drafted 12th overall by a team that also had the 18th overall pick, like the Lions could not stand a chance to miss out on Gibbs, and they traded away Swift. Like you said, 174 carries, 50 targets is our current projection. And I mean, ever since draft day, it's been nothing but, we got to move up Gibbs. We got to move up Gibbs. I mean, in Dynasty, in redraft, he's just the absolute hottest commodity. I think the reason that you and I both picked Achane when we talked about this being the premise for the show is because Gibbs was too obvious, right? Gibbs was like the easy answer for what rookie got the best landing spot. So he definitely falls into our honorable mentions.
Yeah, I failed to CC Dario on my 3 players. So he picked 3 players and left the obvious ones there in case I selected them. Yet we both picked the exact same players because I failed to CC him. But that's how much in sync the man and the machine were with these projections, Dario. So I love it. That's why I said, you know what?
It's dangerous. Like I said, it's
roll
dangerous.
With it. We're just going to roll with it because we're so in sync on this. We have to talk about it. We have a question in here from, I think it's Ja Webb. Does draft capital count as much when the Lions reach like they do? It's a fair point. The Lions did reach. However, concurrent with what they did with Swift and move on from him, I think those two together say it all, right? That they plan on using Gibbs. They plan on using him to an extreme amount. I would not going to say like to the Bijan level, right? Bijan goes top 8, but still, I think it's safe to say that Gibbs is easily the number 2 in this draft class, and he has a real chance to compete with Bijan in terms of total production, just because of the passing game.
I think that the Falcons are less invested in Algier than the Lions are in Montgomery, right? The competition that they have to share their backfields with, one's a 5th round pick. The other one is a free agent that they gave a lot of money to. 12 million it's not a ton of money, but it's a lot for this running back free agency class. I mean, it was him, Miles Sanders, and Jamal Williams that really headlined that class. But I think that with regards to the reaching question, I think that when you look at what an NFL team does in the draft, that's when teams are telling you how they really feel about players. And maybe the rest of the league and public analysts might think that was a reach, but we also don't know if there was another team waiting to draft him in the top 20. I mean, we think it's unlikely, and we think it's a mistake from a roster construction standpoint. But, I mean, drafting Saquon 2nd overall was a mistake from a roster construction standpoint, and he still put up crazy numbers in fantasy. So that high investment means that team is going to be very interested in using that player a lot on the field, and that's going to lead to a lot of fantasy points. There's no way around it.
Speaking of fantasy points, Dan had a question about the projections. Achane, do the projections have Achane producing more than Addison? As of right now, it's roughly 20 fantasy points. It's just because the involvement on the ground and on the air for Achane, we do, like we talked about earlier. We have Achane projected for, let me pull it back up.
We have Achane for 158 fantasy points and Addison for 176. And that's
what am I looking at then?
Maybe you're looking at half. Oh, Underdog has half PPR. That's probably what the difference. If you're looking at the
Okay,
underdog rankings.
Yeah. Okay. So
in PPR, the edge is to Addison by about 20 points. In half PPR, it goes back toward Achane. So it's very slight, but you're probably going to have to draft them in similar areas. I think Addison's ADP is around 100 right now. And like you mentioned, Achane's are closer to 130, but I think that they're probably going to end up both in the top 100 for sure.
One more question about Gibbs, and then we'll move on to our next honorable mention. Is there no concern with Gibbs when the Lions weren't really willing to get Swift heavily involved? Different kinds of players, but Swift essentially turned into a third down back and didn't produce much. First and foremost, we cannot ignore the draft capital that was just spent on Jahmyr Gibbs. I think that says enough between the two of them. Second, we saw that Swift was, pretty much a glass house, consistently injured, wasn't in the coach's good graces. I think they were afraid to get him on the field more because of that reason, and they probably doubted his commitment, therefore reducing his workload. I joked around saying that, Swift had probably, slept with Deuce Staley's wife or something, but Deuce Staley's not there. He's now at the Panthers, and they still get rid of him, which was good for fantasy. But I think it just says everything we need to know about Swift. They didn't trust him. They did not, trust his health, and they didn't spend the draft capital like they just did on Gibbs. I think all those things together, I think, say enough.
And I think another point that's key is DeAndre Swift was drafted by the previous regime in Detroit.
Good point.
The current general manager, the current head coach were not with the Lions when they drafted Swift, and they have gone out of their way to draft Gibbs. So I think that
look at the machine pulling out the man points.
More about how they're going to use him and how much how strongly they feel about him.
I'm so proud of the machine talking about coaches over here and schemes. That's so manly. It's not machiney. All right, last honorable mention before we close the pod. Kendre Miller, running back here. So Kendre comes in as our running back 57, right? Drafted by pick 308, heads over to New Orleans. I can't even say that today. Man, I can't talk today. What is going on? This one, we love the player. We love the talent, right? And the problem is just landing spot. It breaks down to he's playing behind Alvin Kamara until we know about the suspension. They all go out and sign Jamal Williams, who was at $4 million a year, roughly. And so there's also a tight end, Taysom Hill, who was vulturing Alvin Kamara. What do you think he's going to do to Kendre Miller? Of course he's going to vulture Kendre Miller. So again, just a lot of pieces on the ground already playing ahead of Kendre Miller, a lot of uncertainty as well with Alvin Kamara. There's a lot to be concerned about. What do you think, Dario?
Kendre Miller has, I think, if I had to venture a guess, he probably has the widest range of outcomes
absolutely
among the running backs in this class. I mean, you could say that maybe it's Zach Charbonnet because there's going to be, we don't know how that backfield is going to shake out.
Maybe,
but I think that it's Kendre because his floor is lower than Charbonnet's. Like Charbonnet is going to probably get at least 30% of the touches in Seattle, maybe 20 if he's just completely objectively worse than Kenneth Walker. But I don't think that that'll be how Pete Carroll sees it. But Kendre Miller, if somehow Alvin Kamara avoids a suspension yet again, and he's stuck behind Kamara and Jamal Williams and Taysom Hill still stealing carries like he probably will, it's going to be very difficult for him to see the field. That's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario, Kamara is suspended for 6-8 games, and he and Jamal Williams, I mean, they're kind of similar body types. They're both slightly bigger. They're both bruisers. So maybe he gets that passing workload. We know he's a little bit more capable in the passing game than Jamal Williams is, and he gets those valuable touches and targets while Kamara is suspended, and he entrenches himself and does win a role by the end of the season. I mean, we've seen rookie running backs have massive championship winning weeks down the stretch because they've earned their way into a bigger role. I mean, Miles Sanders' rookie year comes to mind, but that's such a wide range of outcomes for Kendre Miller. It's really difficult to project him where we currently sit any higher than this because of that touch distribution in New Orleans.
Yeah, and looking at the projections, like we gave Kendre Miller a 24% rush share, and this backfield was so difficult to project, like you said, because Alvin Kamara, you have to give him at least 30%. We gave him 32%. We had to account for Jamal Williams seeing an uptick in carries once Alvin Kamara is suspended, so we gave him 30%. We slid Kendre Miller at 24%. We even knocked Taysom Hill down sub 10%, which he's been over. We only gave him 32 rushing attempts, which is in my opinion, probably low for what he has done in the past. And so 100% agree with you. Very, very, very wide range of outcomes. Like this could be a guy who ends up becoming the RB2 in this offense, could potentially become the RB1 of this offense second half of the season. And he might be a player that you can rely on down the stretch the most. Or, like you said, he could be third in the depth chart and playing behind the tight end. And so there's so much risk baked into Kendre Miller. He's one of those players that you just have to know at ADP. You're going to risk it for the biscuit. He's either going to significantly outperform it or he's going to, significantly underperform. And you have to be okay with that when you select him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that another thing to keep in mind is we love Kendre Miller in Dynasty. I think this is a good landing spot for him Dynasty-wise because Jamal Williams probably only has 1 or 2 years left of legit fantasy relevance. Alvin Kamara is in a very uncertain place, and we know the Saints get themselves in these ridiculous salary cap situations. And then, everyone thought it was inevitable that they would cut Michael Thomas this year, and then they didn't. So Kamara might be around for a little while longer, but I think that, probably 2-3 years from now, Kamara is going to be 30. Jamal Williams is going to be 30. Kendre Miller could have this backfield all to himself, and we love his profile. So this is not one where we are completely saying, don't draft the guy, never think about the guy. We're not touching him in any format. This is more of we're a little bearish on the projections right now, but we still like the player. We still like the landing spot from a dynasty perspective.
One question, just because I want to post it, because I think it's funny. Any Chase Brown love? No Chase Brown love today. No Chase Brown love today.
Let's just say we think he's worse than Chris Evans, and he's got an uphill climb to being Joe Mixon's backup.
And that is from the machine. I am the man. I agree. I am Billy Muzio. You're also listening to Dario. I always mispronounce your last name. Is it Offstein? Offstein?
It's Offstein, yeah.
Oh, I was right the first time. All right. I should have just stuck with it instead of asking. Okay. Well, that is it, everybody. Glad you liked the Man versus the Machine talking about rookie projections. We'll be back next week as well. We'll see you all back then. Take care. Thanks for tuning in and have a good night.